I am David, and I once had a near-death experience that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It all began on an ordinary evening when I suddenly felt an unusual weakness in my body. At first I thought it was just regular fatigue, but when my breathing became difficult and my entire body went numb, I knew that something was wrong. My family rushed me to the hospital. The doctors hurriedly examined me and discovered that I was suffering from a severe anaphylactic shock, possibly due to an allergy to an insect I had never known about. As they wheeled me into the emergency room, I felt my heartbeat slowing down. The sounds around me began to fade, and the light in the room grew dim. I heard the doctors shouting something, and then suddenly, I was no longer there. I realized that I was floating above the hospital bed, looking down at my own body. I saw the doctors frantically doing everything they could to keep me alive, while my family stood outside the emergency room, tears streaming down their faces. A fleeting sadness washed over me, but strangely, I felt no fear. As I looked around, I realized that I could go anywhere just by thinking about it. I decided to go to the waiting room, where my mother and younger brother were praying. I heard my mother sobbing, "Lord, please don't let my son leave us. I beg you, please save him." An indescribable emotion surged within me. I wanted to tell my mother that I was okay, that I was still there. I tried calling out to her, but she couldn't seem to hear me. But then, suddenly she lifted her head and looked around as if she had just sensed my presence. I knew somehow that souls could still feel each other, even when separated between two worlds. Just as I was trying to understand what was happening, a beam of light appeared beside me. It wasn't blinding, but it carried an overwhelming sense of peace. I felt myself being drawn toward it, and in the blink of an eye, I was no longer in the hospital. I found myself standing in a vast, boundless space. Before me stretched an enormous ocean, but the water wasn't water. It was millions, billions of souls flowing together like an endless current. I knew that these were souls who had once lived on Earth and were now continuing their journey. I noticed something extraordinary. Each soul in this ocean had its own light, its own existence, yet they all moved in perfect harmony, with purpose. I understood that everyone had a path, a mission, even after leaving the physical world. Curious, I focused on one soul among them, a middle-aged woman with long, shimmering silver hair. The moment I concentrated on her, she turned to look at me and smiled. In that instant, without any words, I understood that she was welcoming me with love and understanding. As I continued to observe, a gentle voice spoke from behind me, "David, it is not your time." I turned around and saw a majestic figure, a tall man in a white robe, his face radiant with light. I didn't need anyone to tell me. I knew without a doubt that this was Jesus. He looked at me with eyes full of love and said, "You have a mission that is not yet complete. You must go back." I suddenly remembered my family, my mother praying for me at the hospital. I understood that I couldn't leave yet, that there were still things I had to do. But I also felt a deep longing to stay in this beautiful place. Jesus smiled and placed his hand on my shoulder. "Remember that I am always with you, no matter where you are. When you return, tell everyone that my love is eternal, that every soul is cherished, and that no one is ever forgotten." A brilliant light surrounded me, and then I was pulled backward. I woke up in a panic. The doctors stood around me, looking at me in astonishment. A nurse quickly ran outside to call my family. My mother rushed in, tears streaming down her face. "My son, you came back." I felt my body still weak, but my soul was filled with energy. I remembered everything: the ocean of souls, my encounter with Jesus, his message. When I shared my experience, not everyone believed me immediately. But one thing was certain: I was no longer the same person. I was no longer afraid of death, because I knew that another world was waiting. I no longer worried about the suffering in this life, because I understood that everything had a purpose. I became a person who lived with stronger faith, loved more, and always reminded myself that no matter how difficult life may be, God is always with us, and everything will be okay. After being discharged from the hospital, I began to notice strange changes in the way I perceived the world. Before, I used to doubt the existence of God. I once thought that religion was merely a spiritual comfort, a belief created by people to cling to in fear of death. But now, after what I had experienced, I knew more clearly than ever that God is real, that He is everywhere, and that He loves us more than we can imagine. One of the strangest things that happened right after I left the hospital was a conversation between me and my mother. One evening, my mother sat beside me and asked, "Do you really believe that you met God?" I looked at my mother with certainty and said, "Mom, I didn't just meet God. I saw his work in every soul. And do you remember when you prayed in the waiting room at the hospital?" My mother's eyes widened in shock. "How do you know? You were in the emergency room at that time." I smiled and repeated her exact prayer, word for word. My mother burst into tears. She hugged me tightly and said, "God truly showed you that. He let you return to prove to everyone that he is real." From that day on, my mother began sharing my story with others, and many people came to me to listen. One day I visited my aunt, my mother's sister. When I saw her, I immediately remembered what my grandmother had told me while I was in the hospital. "Tell my daughter that I don't want her to cry for me anymore. I want to see her happy." I took my aunt's hand and told her everything. She broke down in tears. No one knew this. No one knew that every night I sat by the window and cried because I missed my mother. I held her hand and said, "She has always been here, Aunt. She doesn't want to see you in pain anymore. She wants to see you live happily because she has never truly left." From that day on, I saw my aunt become happier, more open. She started attending church prayer meetings, and for the first time in years, she truly smiled. Since that experience, my life has never been the same. I no longer fear the future, nor do I doubt death. I know that when that day comes, I will be reunited with God and my loved ones in his kingdom. I have spent more time helping those around me. I visit people who are terminally ill in hospitals, comforting them, sharing with them what I have seen. I want them to understand that death is not the end, but a new beginning. I also started reading the Bible more, and I realized that what I had experienced was entirely aligned with what Jesus taught. In John 14:2, Jesus says, "My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you?" I understood that the visions I had seen, the ocean of souls, the radiant light, the absolute peace, were the places that God had prepared for all of us. And I also remembered his words to me, "Tell everyone that my love is eternal, that every soul is cherished, and that no one is ever forgotten." I have dedicated the rest of my life to doing just that. I travel everywhere to share my story, to remind people that we are never alone, that no matter how difficult life may be, we are always loved by our Creator. I don't know why God chose to send me back, but I know that I have a mission. And that mission is to spread hope, spread love, spread the truth that we never truly die. We are simply going home. No matter how hard life gets, no matter how great the challenges, I always remind myself, everything will be okay. We don't have to be afraid. We have God, and he never abandons us. And when that day comes, when I once again cross the boundary between two worlds, I know that a loving hand will reach out to welcome me, and I will hear that familiar voice once more. "Welcome home, David. I have always been here waiting for you."